Welcome to WOW, the Woman of the Week podcast. This episode was made possible by a sponsorship from Syneos Health. For more information, visit syneoshealth.com. In this episode, Taryn Grome, co-founder and editor-in-chief at PharmaVOICE, visits with Helen Thackray, MD, Chief R&D Officer, BioCryst Pharmaceuticals.
Dr. Thackray, welcome to our WOW podcast program.
Thank you very much, Taryn. Thank you for the invitation to join you.
I'm really eager to dig in. I am fascinated by your career journey. Can you please share with our audience some of the highlights, including your time at the National Human Genome Research Institute at the National Institutes of Health, as well as a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics?
Thank you. I would be happy to share some of my journey. And when I think about it, there are a few things that stand out to me that perhaps shaped the direction that I took. First, I am fortunate to have been surrounded by women in science all my life. And on reflection, what's remarkable to me is the simple normality of that in my own youth and educational experience, that a woman could pursue a scientific career. And second, I was able to follow my interests and to do so even when they took me in a direction that I had not anticipated. So I'll go through some of how that unfolded. So with the first one, with being a woman in science, both of my parents were educated as scientists, and they both went on to careers in science. And so that was my baseline. Both parents, including my mother, were scientists. My mom was one of several female science teachers at my high school, and another of those, my AP chemistry teacher, showed such enthusiasm that in her teaching that it was infectious. And this led me to just assume that I would be a scientist too, heavily influenced by smart and enthusiastic female role models that I was fortunate to have early on. As an undergraduate, I studied biology and chemistry. I gravitated towards biochemistry and physiology, thinking that I would be a bench scientist at the time. So again, following the influence of some of my early experiences, but then also learning that while my interest was in chemistry and the biological sciences, I was interested in research, and I spent several summers pursuing research internships to gain experience in various experiments and lab techniques. I actually interned at a number of pharmaceutical companies during my undergraduate experience in research and analytical labs. And I didn't know at the time, but I would come back to this later in my career. That provided an opportunity to learn from experienced scientists who were applying their work to practical applications. I then went on to bench research, both in university and after university. I studied for a year at my university medical school and worked as a bench scientist there for a year, again with a strong female lead. And I was able to follow my interest under her mentorship. She was the leader of the lab, actually, and the director of the lab in which I worked following undergraduate work. That was a medical research lab, and I worked in vaccine research. And following that, I came to further appreciate specifically the medical sciences. So advancing from chemistry and biology as basic sciences, but to medical sciences. I was fascinated through my undergraduate years and awed by the complexity and beauty of the human body, how it works from a molecular level through to a behavioral level, and how this is sometimes only understood when we study how it doesn't work. And so this type of question, how do things go wrong in human biology, and the research into it, how do we learn what we can to correct it, led me from my undergraduate work and early research on to medical school. And that was not an obvious decision for me at the time. It took the summer internships that I did. It took the conversations I had with my leader in the research lab and with some others who were mentors to understand myself that I was driven by finding practical medical applications of the research, solving what might be the underlying molecular issue and using that to get it a way to treat. and to apply that treatment rather than staying at the bench. So with that understanding and encouragement from some of the women I worked with, it helped me identify that going to medical school was my next step. It led me to training to become a physician and to studying how we treat in health and in disease. And following the combination of medical research and medical practice, and designing research that involves patients, involves an understanding of a patient's experience and treating a patient's disease, is how I ended up in medical genetics fellowship, which was at the NIH. So your question was sort of a journey towards the National Human Genome Research Institute at the NIH and pediatrics. So it was that pursuit of research, following an interest in medical science, understanding how to apply medical research to medical science that led me to fellowship. And as I was a fellow at NHGRI, the Genome Institute, I was there at the time the human genome was being mapped about 2 decades ago, which was a phenomenal time to be there. And I learned in that setting about clinical trials and the study of the basis of disease and the genetic basis of disease, which then started me on a path towards thinking more about how can we apply what I'd learned in medical school, what I'd learned in research and in genetics and medical genetics, and where to go next. So that's the journey. Pediatrics was in there as well, actually, after medical school and prior to going to the NIH. I trained as a pediatrician. It had some very similar themes. So my career journey started with that early exposure to a concept that it's normal for women to pursue science and leadership in science, and continuing to follow interest in disease, in research, and how to apply that in a practical way.
Thank you so much for sharing that really interesting story and very personal story. And what a gift you had to have been shown that there is this possibility for women to have careers in science and in medicine through those early mentors, including your mom and that middle school teacher. It goes to show how important that STEM concept is, to encourage little girls who then become women, obviously, to pursue their dreams and to incite that passion. So, and then what a gift you also had to be at the NIH during the Human Genome Program. Wow, I can't imagine how exciting that had to have been. That's wonderful. So let's dig in a little bit deeper, because you did make that leap from academic medicine to the biotech sector. And as you noted, it was those summer internships that really led you to maybe an interest in the corporate side of things. So what did it take for you to make that leap? Where did you have to dig into to say, you know what, this is how I'm going to go now?
Yeah, it was not an obvious leap. In the traditional medical training path, you don't have much exposure to industry research or industry during that training. And while I was at the NIH, especially in the clinical center, which is designed to put research labs very close to the patient wards, I was able to see how the biotechnology and medical device specialists from industry worked very closely together with the NIH scientists. And I was exposed to industry research for the first time. I started exploring from there to find out what I could, back to the theme of following an interest. And it was very interesting to me that you could design clinical trials and develop new drugs, advance the field of medical research to bring new therapies to patients, and that you could do that in the setting of a company rather than a university or in the case of the NIH, a government research institution. And as I learned more, I was also introduced to very small biotech, to startups and tiny companies working in areas with a lot of unknowns, with few resources, but with a good idea based and grounded in a scientific concept that was still in the process of being reduced to practice. And these companies were tackling questions on the forefront of genetic diagnosis for the treatment of rare and sometimes very serious disorders, where there was a very, very strong unmet need for therapies that could be effective and safe and alter the course of a patient's disease. So that combination of now following the medical science and medical research, working towards the benefit of patients, tackling large and difficult questions about practical applications of some novel scientific observations, and doing so while trying to perhaps build a tiny company, that just fascinated me. And more than that, I found that I wanted to do that as well. And I was fortunate again to have a very wise mentor, one who was in fact a woman, who was a pediatrician as well, and who made a serendipitous suggestion as I was talking with her, sort of thinking through some of my observations. And she suggested how I might pursue my interest. And that led me to moving into a position running clinical trials in a very small company. It was a big change, not an obvious leap, but one that, again, followed discussions with a mentor and something that I was identifying as my own specific interests.
That's so amazing, and it's really cool that you have had these kinds of mentors along your path. I would also think it's very smart because you obviously sought out wise counsel. Um, and that leap into that unknown of biotech, especially in rare disease, it's so fascinating because there, as you said, there's lots of questions that are being asked, not a lot of obvious answers, and it's often fraught with disappointment. How do you manage through some of that? Because R&D is tough anyway, but when you get into some of these rare diseases and ultra rare diseases, it's even harder. And the expectations are such that you want to, help these people who have no options available. How do you keep yourself buoyed during those times that aren't so successful?
It's challenging, and on the other hand, it's also highly motivating to feel like you're working on something that could have a tremendous impact on others in need. There are a few things that I learned as a pediatrician that I might mention here because they do directly affect how I maintain my own motivation and help others around during what are some of the challenges that inevitably arise. Um, the in pediatrics, I followed medical science into pediatrics, but I also learned something from the pediatricians, which I found is a repeated and valuable lesson. The pediatricians made a profession out of caring for their patients, and they did so. All physicians do that. Pediatricians somehow do this even more so. They're completely focused on the well-being of the child. They balance how to solve the immediate problem with how to work together with parents, with child, with other experts to promote growth of that individual child into a healthy, thriving adult. And that takes a perseverance, it takes patience, it takes compassion. And this was another lesson for me, perhaps the third lesson of my career journey, which is that you can be a scientist and a physician, and you can be compassionate to those around you who are facing immense difficulties, or even when you are facing immense difficulties. And you can use that, build that, thrive on that compassion and share it, which helps motivate both me, in the work I'm doing, as well as others around me. That compassion is not a unique concept. It's present in all the experiences that I've had, certainly, and in other branches of medicine and science. It just was so very visible to me amongst pediatricians, being deliberate, being intentional, practicing compassion to take the time to share a moment of difficulty with a patient and with their parent, and recognizing that that could be just as important in healing pain and suffering as the actual science. Taking this concept and applying it to building resilience, helping motivate through some of the ups and downs that come with research and development. It's been an enormous part of how I've been able to, for myself, keep focusing back to what is most important. Research is, by definition, something in which you don't know what the outcome will be. And so the expected is never what happens, or almost never. And it's actually expected that things don't go as you planned or as hoped. There are ups and downs that come with that. learning to adjust to those is an important element of working in this field. And even knowing that, it can be very hard on the individual, very hard on the physician, the researcher, the teams. I've certainly felt that. And one thing I've learned is to share that sense of difficulty, to share and talk with the individuals I'm working with about what we're enjoying, what we think is going well, the ups, the human, that human side, laughing and sharing some of the joy about what we're doing, but also sharing in the disappointment or challenges, and how you might then think through a challenge, recognizing how it's affecting you as an individual, recognizing and discussing perhaps how it's affecting a team, and perhaps as a leader showing more of the joy and energy to help motivate a team and to go in a common direction when in facing a challenge or a problem that needs to be solved. But in a smaller setting and on a more personal level in conversation with colleagues, it can be just as important to discuss that feeling of common disappointment and to make visible that sort of internal feeling of vulnerability to maybe not being able to achieve what we set out to achieve.
Well said. And I love that the compassion piece is what really drives you, and it comes through in speaking with you. That's a great part of your leadership style. Let's talk a little bit about what excites you about BioCryst pipeline. You're working in that rare disease space. So tell me what the company is working on and what you're doing for hope for patients.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. BioCryst discovers, develops, and commercializes oral therapies for rare diseases. We have our headquarters in Durham, North Carolina, and we have our Discovery Center of Excellence, where our drugs are discovered, in Birmingham, Alabama. And we've also recently expanded as a company into the UK and Europe, which is part of a transformation. We've just launched our first oral therapy as a prophylactic treatment for HAE in the US, Europe, and Japan. We are growing, and we have about 300 employees globally. But my path into the company was a little unusual, and I'm happy to share it. I'm also really excited about what's ahead of us.
Please.
So I first met BioCryst actually just as they were entering this period of transformation. It was a little over 2 years ago. I was invited to join the board of directors to add my experience in rare disease drug development and clinical development to their board. And the company had just successfully completed the pivotal program for their first oral therapy for a rare disease, and they were preparing for registration and launch of that product. They were also moving other investigational products forward in several additional rare diseases. And I joined the board at that time and was a member of the board for 18 months. Over that period of time, I observed a company that had deep expertise in the discovery science and structure-based design using protein crystallography and three-dimensional computer modeling and medicinal chemistry to produce a molecule and develop a molecule bit by bit and produce a rich pipeline of new potential therapies for rare diseases. This is hard to do. So this chemistry, this discovery chemistry, is very hard to do. It's not common for a company to be able to do this and also bring a product all the way through the process, through development in a rare disease and into the commercial space with the launch that's successful in rare disease. That development and commercialization of a drug in rare disease is really a specialty of its own. And it takes learning carefully about the disease, about the treatment that's standard, and how the new medicine will fit into that treatment design, treatment approach, to then design clinical trials and achieve an outcome that meets the needs of patients. It takes listening to those most familiar with the disease, and the patient is our best teacher for this. We're the students. The physicians who provide for these patients are also good teachers for this, and the families who understand what the patient needs. BioCryst was able to not only discover, but then discover the potential medicine, but also work closely with the patients and the physicians to understand how best to design a program, how to successfully gather the information needed to demonstrate efficacy of the drug, and then how to commercialize it into a rare disease space. in a way that was successful across 3 regions in the early launch. So it's really unusual to have all 3 of those elements, the discovery, the development of the drug, and commercialization for rare disease in one small to mid-size biotech company. And I think of us as small to mid-size. And BioCryst has done this. The new lead molecules coming out of the pipeline, there are more that come are in the clinic, and there are more yet to emerge. This is really exciting to me, and I had the opportunity to then join the company to lead the R&D strategy as the company transforms into one that will bring multiple drugs through that process from discovery through development and commercialization for rare disease. So my role is to define and lead the strategy for the pipeline to bring these products through to achieve registration and to build that portion of the company so that we can do more of this. And we're just starting to do that. We have our next program is BCX9930 is the name of the drug. It's a factor D inhibitor, so it's an inhibitor of one of the early aspects in the pathway of complement-mediated disease. And complement-mediated disease is a huge and growing field with many rare diseases within the field. So BioCryst has now this factor D inhibitor in pivotal trials in our next indication in PNH, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, and in 3 kidney indications, 3 renal nephritis indications, and is a drug that has the potential to expand into additional diseases. So we're pursuing 4 different rare diseases with this one drug and plan to expand to pursue more. And there are other molecules behind this in the pipeline looking at additional rare disease targets and moving forward ones in the clinic in FOP, which is a bone growth disorder, and there are further ones behind that. So to me, what's exciting is the potential now realized with the delivery of a medicine in HAE, the potential to continue to discover drugs for rare diseases, to do so in a way that is extremely specialized and provides an orally bioavailable molecule that can be potent and specific and really alter the course of treatment and of patients' lives in multiple rare diseases. We have a lot yet to do. We have a lot of potential and a lot yet to do.
That is exciting, and it is unusual for a company of that size, as you said, to go from discovery all the way through to commercialization. What do you think makes BioCryst different? Why are you able to do it when other companies can't?
It's really interesting. There are 2 things I would say to answer that. One is the extreme and deep expertise in medicinal chemistry, the ability to develop a drug. The other is in the recognition that listening to patients and providers is really important to designing a program that has the greatest likelihood of showing that an effective drug is effective. So let me go through those in a little more detail. The first, with the discovery chemistry, there are many companies who design drugs to fit binding sites or to target a receptor. And designing a potent drug is something that can be achieved by many different companies. Designing one that's really specific to the target and will be selective for the target without having off-target effects is a little harder to do. And it takes refining the molecule so that it is very specific for exactly the target you're trying to hit while not overlapping with other molecular structures that could provide off-target effects. And finally, to do that with an orally bioavailable molecule is very, very difficult, and few companies manage that. And it's a matter of balancing that potency and specificity of the molecule with then the ability to have enough solubility for absorption in the gut and enough of the other characteristics to allow it to be effective after it's been absorbed without being destroyed in the gut. And that's hard to do. So that's one additional element layered on top, which BioCryst has been able to achieve through decades of experience with designing molecules and honed understanding of how to do it in a way that creates a drug that is potent and specific and orally bioavailable. And then the other piece is listening to patients. We are not the experts in any particular rare disease. What we're expert at is understanding that a rare disease requires a different approach in drug development. It requires really working closely with patients and providers to hear what it is that's meaningful to a patient, to understand how that can be captured in a way that is accurate to what's meaningful for a patient. So that's how you design your data points, and how to design that and build it into a clinical trial so that it fits with standard practice in a way that is going to allow the provider to enroll a patient, collect that data, and demonstrate the effect of the drug for that patient. That's drug development, but doing that with multiple different diseases, each of which is in a different maybe target organ system, each of which might be in a different patient group, adults or pediatric patients. That requires asking questions, listening to the answers, building it in, incorporating it into your plans in a way that will help enable you to show if the drug's effective, show it in your clinical trial, and bring that medicine through to patients through registration.
Fascinating. Dr. Thackray, thank you so much for explaining that in a way that a layperson like myself can understand. It's fascinating. When we talk about that rare disease space, there are a lot of complexities, obviously. Where do you see what do you see as the greatest need to be addressed in this sector? I know often pricing gets called into question. We know that it's fraught with, drug development in the space is hard. But where do you see that there is the greatest need to be addressed?
It's actually fairly broad. If I were to think about one greatest need, it's rather than one particular thing I could point at. It's the fact that there are many rare diseases and
Mhm.
many patient populations with those diseases urgently in need of better therapy. So there's a lot more to be done in the field of rare disease. These are diseases that are occur in small enough population sizes that it's more difficult to gather enough patients and enough data to demonstrate a drug is safe and effective. They're small enough that it's also difficult sometimes for a provider even to recognize the disease in a patient. And so patients with rare diseases sometimes struggle to be diagnosed accurately. They struggle to find a therapy that can be effective for them because there are few clinical trials in that area. And they can struggle really to find a way to lead their lives free from pain and suffering. So there's a tremendous need for continued work in multiple rare diseases. I would say far more than is currently being done, even with the focus that we have in industry. And this sort of urgency to continue to do our work quickly and thoroughly to be able to bring new therapies to patients is something that I feel every day.
Excellent, and others as well. So thank you for doing all the great work you're doing on behalf of these patients who are in need. Let's talk a little bit about your time at Glycomimetics, where you led the company's orphan product, fast track, and breakthrough therapy programs in rare diseases and oncology. I would imagine this is where you gained a lot of experience in that clinical trial space and what brought you eventually to BioCryst.
Yes, indeed. I spent almost 15 years at Glycomimetics, and I've been fortunate to work there also with some individuals who are truly excellent in their field. I've learned a great deal from them. I would add also, Taryn, that I'm working currently also as a board member at Immunogen, which is a company developing antibody drug conjugates for treatment of cancers. Glycomimetics is a company that works developing novel treatments for rare disease and cancers. And my experience with Glycomimetics, with Immunogen, is similar in that I really enjoy working with individuals who are passionate about what they're doing and highly expert in their field. So some of my experiences at Glycomimetics included, I would say, more extensive experience in understanding and observing some of the advances in regulatory science that have been applied both in rare disease and in oncology, and deepening my own understanding of some of the commonalities in the drug development path and process between rare disease and oncology. What we see in terms of rare disease sometimes it is also present in unmet needs in severe and advanced cancer therapy. And some of those priority programs that you mentioned, the orphan product programs, priority review, or other regulatory incentive programs, and other ways of identifying promising potential new drugs, such as through the breakthrough therapy program, those are ways that allow for novel drug design to be pursued at innovative companies such as BioCryst, such as Glycomimetics, such as Immunogen, and for a thoughtful and efficient approach that can be evidence driven and working very closely together with the regulators to gather information that's needed to demonstrate safety and efficacy of a product, but also to do so in a way that allows for the rarity of the disease or the severity of the disease or the fact that there is no path that's been previously trod. So one of the challenges in drug development in both of these areas is that you're often working in a disease where there is no prior therapy that has shown how to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. There's no precedent. And it can involve a new class of drug, it can involve a new mechanism of action, it can involve identifying a new clinical endpoint to demonstrate effectiveness and demonstrate what's meaningfully important to patients. And developing a drug for the first time in an indication doing all of that can be daunting with its own set of potential challenges. But it's also really exciting because it gives an opportunity to advance the field, advance the scientific field, advance sometimes the understanding of the disease by learning through demonstrating with a therapy that something can or cannot be affected by a certain mechanism, and to bring a new treatment to patients who have no good alternative. So I think I found as a physician, this is really highly motivating. This is the potential through trials and novel drug development to use some of the paths that have been identified for regulatory efficiency, for bringing new programs through in areas where there's no precedent, and in moving that forward to bring a novel drug to be able to touch medical practice. And in the case of a physician in biotech, to be able to perhaps touch the lives of more patients than I could in routine medical practice.
Wonderful. I love the way you speak about your passion around what you do. It's so inspiring. Let's talk a little bit more about you specifically in terms of your leadership style. How would you describe yourself as a leader?
I listen, and that's perhaps a little unusual in leaders, or at least it was when I was in my first foray into industry. I listen a great deal. I think my natural tendency is to pause and hear what others are saying in a conversation. At this point in my career, I found that asking questions and listening to the responses, or simply listening to a discussion, is a very valuable aspect of my leadership style. I frequently will hear perspectives or suggestions that turn out to be really important to consider, and I would not have considered them otherwise. I can incorporate that into my decision making for how to proceed with my team. And the result is usually better than it would have been if I had done something or made a decision on my own. So my leadership style definitely includes listening. It also includes sharing that. I go back to some of the concepts I learned in pediatrics. It's not only observing and listening, but it's sharing what you see, what you observe, how you're thinking, and how some of what other people are offering and different perspectives changes my own thinking. So in leadership, when I think of leadership in clinical trials and leading physicians and other individuals who have great expertise in clinical trials, it's understanding the perspectives of those who have experience doing this before. And sometimes that's the experts around me. Sometimes that's the patient's view or the parent's view. Sometimes it's the experts in the field who are not within the company but have been treating patients with a certain disease for many, many years. But leadership through what I would call maybe careful questioning, probing questioning, listening to the answer, and understanding the experience and perspective of others. That's absolutely critical to get to the best outcomes for whatever the issue is, the best outcomes for decision making, the best outcomes in leading a team.
Wonderful. As as a woman sitting in the C-suite, you're obviously a role model to other female scientists and doctors, and you had some tremendous role models as you were coming up. But what does this responsibility mean to you? And any advice you can share to those who might like to leave the bench and also reach the C-suite?
So I am really grateful to be in the work that I'm in now. I've had the opportunity, as we said, to be a scientist, practicing physician, a clinical researcher, now an executive in biotechnology. I've worked hard, but it's been work that I really enjoy. And I feel just tremendously privileged to have had the opportunity to go from practice with patients to clinical research in the setting of industry to leading others in that. When I think about this, I think about the role model and the importance of role models in my own development. And I reflect on not only how fortunate I was, but how much that their influence embedded in me, as I said earlier, that simple sort of normalcy that women are leaders in science. I had early experiences that continue to be examples through my career. I hope that by hearing some of my own experiences, I can help other women also realize that it is normal for women to be leaders in science and in medicine. And in terms of thinking about how to go from one step to the next, I think it's finding those things that are important to you, that really drive you. That may sound very typical, but it's really, really critically important. Recognizing, I found that for me, recognizing in myself that there was a path from one step to the next, that I was following an interest. I was a scientist and I wanted to apply that to medicine. So I was able to do that. I was a physician and a pediatrician, and I realized I wanted to move to do research in industry. Those are not moves I would have anticipated at the beginning of my career, or even midway through, perhaps. But I found that I sought out mentors. I asked them their experience. I asked them their thoughts on hearing my observations and my experience. And I was uh, able to be, the recipient of some very good observations and advice. And I would encourage others to think about what it is they enjoy. Is there another way to pursue that? And are there individuals who have different experiences who can um, discuss that with you, perhaps advise on how you're thinking about it? And no one can tell anyone which direction they should go, but it's very helpful sometimes to have a wise mentor who can help you think through your own observations and your own direction of thinking. And this certainly contributed to my own sense of direction in my career.
Excellent. I love the way you put that. We're going to normalize women in science and make this that it shouldn't be abnormal, that it should be just part and parcel of the course. Finally, I'd love for you to tell me about an accomplishment or a wow moment that shaped or changed the trajectory of your career.
There was a moment, not a single moment, but a time in one of the clinical programs that I was pursuing where we learned in the program that there was an observation in our clinical trial that we had not expected. And it was a positive observation. It was one that we had not expected, and it was one that took some thinking through to understand the implications. Um, it was in a program working in sickle cell disease, which is an inherited and rare blood disorder that causes great pain and many complications over the course of a life. And in the study that we were doing, we were assessing a number of different things related to the pain that individuals experienced, and also related to their use of opioids for that pain. They often will have to seek medical care and relief for their pain. And in that setting, they were seeking medical care and hospitalization for relief of pain. And the treatment was to give IV opioids, which were delivered through a patient-controlled device, what's called patient-controlled anesthesia. And in the trial, one of the observations that we've made, it was not a primary endpoint, but it was a very interesting finding, and one that was incredibly meaningful, was that patients who were on these IV opioids in the hospital, when they started to feel better, when the source of their pain started to be resolved, they actually deliberately chose not to use the patient-controlled anesthesia, and their opioid dose administration and self-administration dropped incredibly. It was a huge finding and a huge drop in opioid use. The impact of what it meant to the physicians as we were presenting it to them was amazing to me. It meant to the physicians that their patients' pain was demonstrated as having a real organic cause. Their patient's pain was something that was more than an experience. It was part of the disease, and a disabling part of the disease with an organic cause. And once you resolved that underlying mechanism of pain, the patients were choosing of their own to reduce their use of opioids and demonstrating that the pain was a true consequence of the disease. This was a new finding at that point in the study of sickle cell disease. It was a known observation. Physicians and patients knew that the pain was caused by the disease, but it was difficult to demonstrate because there was no way to treat that underlying cause and show through sort of cause and effect that the opioid use was no longer required. And we were able to see that in our trial. And that to me was a really meaningful moment. We had done through something that was a secondary objective in our clinical trial. We'd done something that would demonstrate that patients really needed true therapies that really cured the underlying cause of the pain in a way that no one had done before. And I felt it was meaningful. It was precious to me to see how much the physicians appreciated having this data and how excited they were at thinking about how they could use it in discussions with their patients, completely unrelated to the drug that we were studying. This was something that just gave them a tool to help their patients understand better their own disease and their own pain. That to me was the defining moment. It really brought it home that what we could do in industry could touch hundreds and thousands of lives in a way that is incredibly important.
Thank you for sharing that very important finding, and what a game changer. Wow. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you. I am looking forward to seeing what you do next and your continued success at BioCryst. You truly are a remarkable leader and a maverick in the space. So thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your journey and your story with us.
Thank you very much, Taryn. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of WOW, the Woman of the Week podcast. And thanks again to Syneos Health for sponsoring this episode. For more information, visit syneoshealth.com. And don't forget to check out our other WOW podcast episodes at pharmavoice.com/wow. This 2021 program is copyrighted by PharmaLinks LLC.